Welcome to the Vietnam War and Foreign Conflicts Foundation, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to educate our future generations about the Vietnam War and subsequent foreign conflicts. To enhance the experience, the Foundation is currently working to establish a new museum to house our collection of Vietnam War artifacts that will be open to the public. The intent of the museum is to promote healing, show gratitude to those who served, and bring a hands-on experience to those interested in learning about the history of the Vietnam War. If you are interested in learning more about the Foundation, please visit our website at VietnamWarFoundationMuseum.com.
We're here today with Bobby Cabell, chairman of the Vietnam War and Foreign Conflicts Museum. His associate in crime over here, Larry Saunders, vice chairman with the museum as well. Special guest today is Mr. John Harrison, Vietnam veteran, entered the Army as a private, commissioned as an infantry second lieutenant upon completion of officer candidate school at 20 years of age, and while in Vietnam served as a rifle platoon leader, executive officer, and company commander, including combat operations incidental to the Tet Offensive. He's a lawyer and author. And John, share with us some of the highlights of your book, The Steel Rain, the Tet Offensive of 1968, and your article, The Tet Offensive 68, Battle Won, Victory Lost.
We'll start with the book. Steel Rain is a collection, excuse me, of articles that I wrote over a number of years, and I wrote them as they came to me, rather than in some order to write a book. I wasn't planning on writing a book. I was just writing them for myself, sort of to tell the story, some of the stories of what happened during the year that I was in Vietnam. And when I would write one, I would post it on my blog, which is Johnny Harrison WordPress. But John Harrison Tet will take you there. John Harrison Vietnam will take you there. But I wrote the book in incremental stories, and I would post them there. And they started being read by many of the guys that I'd served with in Vietnam. And they would write me back and say, you know, you forgot this LT, or you could add this LT, or what do you think about this? And if I remembered it, I'd put it in. And then they've also written several squibs about the stories, and I used some of them in the book as a lead-in to the story which they were talking about. So, and then after I got, 15 or 20 of the stories out there, several of the guys said, you got to make a book, LT. You just got to put it together. So I put it together in a book, and it's published only on Amazon. You can get it in Kindle, or you can get it in paperback. And as a result of that, I received even more feedback from people. And one of the things I received a lot of feedback on, getting specifically to the Tet Offensive, was a lot of the guys are still angry. There's no other way to say it. They are angry about the treatment that the war got and still gets, the misinformation that's put out about the war. So using Tet as sort of an example, most people, I think, that are not Vietnam vets and haven't read about it or studied the subject, think A, we lost the war, and B, we lost the Battle of Tet. Well, from a military standpoint, neither of those is really correct. Looking at this little chart that I have here, we got the Battle of the Bulge and Tet. The Battle of the Bulge was at the end part of World War II. Prior to the Battle of the Bulge, a lot of people were saying the troops would be home by Christmas, that the Germans are in complete and irreversible retreat, that this is the end of the war is over, the German army is finished. And then, of course, 400, almost 500,000 Germans attacked through the Ardennes forest and created the Bulge. And the idea of being home by Christmas went out the barn door, and the 101st Airborne Division, my division, spent Christmas in Bastogne until they were ultimately relieved by the 3rd Army led by George Patton. And by the by, the lieutenant colonel leading the first group of Patton's tanks into Bastogne was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who was the man that took over from General Westmoreland in Vietnam. But you get to this chart, in the Battle of the Bulge, there were roughly 541,000 U.S. troops. In Tet, there were roughly 540,000 United States troops. Now, there's been some discussion. The numbers, nobody ever really agrees with the numbers. And part of that is not people just disagreeing to disagree, although there's some of that too. But part of that is because, for example, in Tet, they sent the 3rd Brigade of the 82nd Airborne over to Vietnam to reinforce about 3 days after Tet started. And that's 20,000 men total, with all the support forces that went with them and so forth. So that made a big difference in the numbers. So the relationships are what's important here, not the exact totals. But roughly about the same number. Now, the Bulge, you had, roughly 1 million or more British soldiers as well, and during Tet, you had about 1 million South Vietnamese troops as well. So I'm not ignoring them in this, but I'm saying that there is a comparability there. Now, in the Battle of the Bulge, the number of casualties, the KIA killed in action, WIA wounded in action, the total was 81,500 during the Battle of the Bulge. The total for Tet was 38,240. So roughly twice as many Americans were wounded or killed in the Battle of the Bulge as were wounded or killed in the Battle of Tet. Now, I broke this other one out. Usually this would be together, KIA, WIA, missing and captured. But I broke it out because it's important. Gives you an idea of one of the significant differences between the two battles. The 23,500 American soldiers were captured at the Battle of the Bulge. During the entire year of 1968, including Tet 1, Mini Tet, and the August part of Tet, phase 3 of Tet, there were a total of 158 American soldiers that were captured. So no American unit in the Battle of Tet was broken. Every single one of them succeeded in driving off whoever was attacking them, and in some cases they had to retreat and then come back and counterattack. But regardless of it, they maintained their unit integrity. They did not surrender. They did not give up. They maintained a military presence. That was not true in the Battle of the Bulge, particularly the 106th Division. 2 brigades of it, roughly 2/3 of the division, were captured by the Germans. Now, during the Battle of the Bulge on the other side, there were 449 Nazis that attacked, give or take. Again, the number is subject to some dispute because after the initial onslaught, the Germans, of course, continued to reinforce. So depending upon where you pick the time to say this many people were fighting, and some had been killed, some had been wounded, and so forth, so it's a moving target. But the idea is roughly 500,000. VC NVA in South Vietnam and supporting in Cambodia and Laos, again, roughly 500,000. So we're talking about comparable levels of troops on both sides of the equation. For the Germans, the Nazis, somewhere between 67,000 and 125,000 were wounded, killed, or captured during the entirety of the action. So roughly, you add these two together, roughly 100,000 Americans in the Battle of the Bulge were wounded or killed, and roughly somewhere, say, 90,000 Germans were wounded or killed. And you go down at the bottom and you look in any book, any history book, you look at Wikipedia, any description of the Battle of the Bulge, they will say that it was a profound American victory. Winston Churchill called it the greatest American battle, the greatest American victory of World War II. And he was right. It was a big battle, a hard-fought battle, but it was won by the Americans, and I might add my division had a little bit to do with that. Now, coming back to the other side, though, in Vietnam, the VC, and mostly it was VC, I'll come back to that in a minute, but mostly the VC in VA suffered wounded and KIA, wounded and killed, of somewhere between 125 and 150,000 during Tet. The initial onslaught was about 80,000, and they moved reinforcements up to support those troops. And I'm also including the troops that they had around Khe Sanh, which was going on at the same time. So they had roughly somewhere between 125, 150,000 wounded and killed. And in addition to that, they had 5,000 captured during that battle. So somewhere between 130 and 150,000 losses on their side. However, when you look at the battle, you look at the history books, most of them today will say, while there was an American tactical victory on the ground, it was a strategic defeat for the United States. And what's wrong with that is, A, in the first place, this is more than a tactical victory. This is a crushing blow. And when I said earlier, mostly VC, the original North Vietnam general in charge of this battle was a guy named Tron. And he died of a heart attack before the battle started. And way before the battle started, actually. But it had been planned. They'd been moving supplies and equipment. They'd been moving troops. So the battle was going to go forward with or without that general. So they moved General Giap back. And Giap was opposed to this idea, which was why he was not commanding it in the first place. But he was a loyal communist, and he was generally agreed a very good general. And his idea was that he had to maximize the number of Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, Viet Cong, in this battle to achieve the political result that they wanted from the Battle of Tet. Tet was really not for them. It was not really a military battle in the sense that we would consider it a military battle because it was too widely separated. And one of the reasons it was too widely separated was the communists expected that the real force behind this battle, that the hard point of the spear would be these forces that attacked, but that the number of people behind the battle would be units of the South Vietnamese army that defected and went to the communists, and that the South Vietnamese would rise. In other words, they believed their own propaganda, which was that the only reason the South Vietnam was continuing to fight was because of the Americans. You get rid of the Americans, the war goes away. Well, it didn't happen. And it was wrong in the first place. And their major goal was that, and they didn't achieve it. Now, when you defeat the enemy's major goal, we define that as victory, one word. And we defeated their goal, and not only did we defeat their goal, but we literally destroyed the Viet Cong. They never recovered. They never recovered. They could never get number of men back to fight. They could never get the cadre that they had to fight. In the area I was in Phan Thiet, we killed the Viet Cong province chief. We killed the Viet Cong military chief. We killed the Viet Cong chief tax collector. All of these guys had been used as guides to guide the other Viet Cong main force units to attack my unit. Well, we went out the day before the battle and shot them, so they weren't there anymore. And when the battle was over, they weren't there. So the Viet Cong, from one end of the country to the other end of the country, they lost all this infrastructure that they'd had. People that had been clandestine fighters for them, going back to the French, in some cases going all the way back to the Japanese in the 1940s. Some of these guys had literally been at war for over 20 years. And after 20 years, if you're still alive and you're still active, you're either really good at being a soldier or you're really lucky. But the former is most likely true, that you're really good at being a soldier. Now, looking at these numbers again, what you have at this point then, any analysis of just the numbers of this battle, you would say that Tet was A, a bigger battle, and B, a bigger victory for the United States. The most significant difference between the two was that in the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans did have a lot of tanks and a lot of armored vehicles. The Viets did not have that. The Viet Cong didn't have it, the NVA didn't have it. They had a few up in the mountains, but not very many, really. And they did not affect the battle at all. Also, in the Battle of the Bulge, initially in the Battle of the Bulge, the weather was bad, and therefore American and Allied air power was not as potent a force as it would have been. That was not the case during Tet. Tet happened in the summer, and in the summer of Vietnam, it is hot, it is clear, and it's actually a pretty place. I mean, and the people are really nice, except when they're shooting at you. But as a result of this battle, the war in Vietnam, the guerrilla war in Vietnam, was over. No more did that happen anymore. From this point forward, rather than these small unit attacks from Viet Cong, hardcore Viet Cong, which are Viet Cong units that are kept in a unit formation, most of the Viet Cong were local force units, and they would go out and fight at night, and they'd come back during the day and be the barber at the base in Phan Thiet, for example. Our barber turned out was one of the Viet Cong. I always wondered about the guys that went there and got a shave with this guy with a razor right on their neck.
Yeah.
That was kind of exciting thought to come back to. When you look at these two battles, and you look at what people think about them today, and more important, you look at how they're still described today in general histories. Now, in specific histories of the war, like mine, my book, or several other books about the war, a guy named Harry Rothman, a colonel, wrote a book about the war. You can look that one up. That's on Amazon as well. And he describes the entire war. And from 1968 on, it was no longer anything approaching a guerrilla war. It was asymmetrical only in the sense that the Viet Cong and the NVA generally stayed outside of Vietnam, and they would come in from Cambodia, or they would come up from the tunnels of Cu Chi down in the south near Saigon, and they would fight at that point. They did not, however, go out at night and do the things that they used to do before. They went out in much larger units, and one of the reasons they did that was they just didn't have anybody do it. They were gone. And that history has been misstated from the beginning and ignored from the beginning. Now, after the war was over, during the war, the United States said roughly 980,000, give or take a few, Viet Cong and NVA were killed during the war by American forces. The French said roughly 200,000. Viet Minh, which was the communist forces were called at that time, were killed while they were there. The Vietnamese look at this, they look at it as the French War, and the American War is a continuation of the French War. As a result, you've got roughly 1,100,000 reported. Now that number, particularly the American part of that number, has been vilified and deprecated. They said they lied. They said they inflated it. They said they did all sorts of things. However, after the war was over, the government of Vietnam, which is now the communist government of Vietnam, put out its report, and its report said that they lost 1,100,000 soldiers during the war. Actually, works out to be a few more than MACV reported during the war. So the number was actually conservative, and it was at least correct in how far it went, and it could have gone even higher. Now that has not been generally reported. People still say things like the number of Vietnamese Viet Cong casualties was overstated on purpose. No, I'm sure that happened from time to time, but apparently it's hard to count somebody when you do what's called carpet bombing by a B-52 and they do an arc light and they drop several tons of high explosives. There's not a lot left to count when they do that. And those conclusions were not included in the numbers. They also neglect the idea that the guys down in Saigon were just taking the numbers from the field and writing them down and putting them out without thinking about them. That's not the way the Army works. They did their own calculation after they got what they would call the raw reports from the field to try and figure out what it really was. And they would look at both their intelligence as to how many were involved in a particular firefight, and then they'd look at the report to see how many were reported as killed. The other thing about the war, at the conclusion of the war, a guy named Drummel, an academic, did a study called a mortality study of the Vietnam War. It's pure academic, peer-reviewed, so forth. He came up with the same numbers. So you've got originally American Army officers and others signing a report, a military report, to go to higher command, so they base decisions about battles on those reports. Secondly, you've got the opponents saying, yeah, those numbers are right. And third, you've got an academic that reviewed the numbers, reviewed the entire war much later, and said, yeah, it's right. Now, when you put all of this together, and you talk about the Vietnam War, when I say that the troops were at best disgusted, Bobby, what do you think about that?
Well, I was there in '68 during the time of Tet. I got in on the last end of it, and I'm just like you, John. I just can't understand why, most American success in the war, why did they deny it? I mean, like, not recognize it. It may be something in one of your answers you can tell us about that. But it was truly a lot of propaganda that came out of this war.
It was. Larry?
Well, I may have missed it, but, according to your numbers and everything, we won. And we beat.
We crushed them.
We crushed them.
Yeah.
But why did we give in? Why did we give in to them?
Well, what happened after this is important. It's not
That's
really
what I
the
want you to
subject, but
tell our
what
listeners.
happened after this is important as well. If General Wheeler went over to Vietnam after Tet, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, of which General Wheeler was the chairman, was very concerned that the strategic reserve of the United States had been severely depleted. That is to say, most of the strategic reserve of the United States, people that go into action immediately, involves 2 Marine divisions and the 82nd and 101st Airborne Division. You had the entire 101st at this point deployed in Vietnam, and you had 1 brigade from the 82nd deployed in Vietnam. And both Marine divisions, in effect, were in Vietnam as well. So they had no reserve at this point. They wanted a reserve of about 200,000. So he went over there and he tried to convince Westmoreland to ask for 200,000 more troops. And Westmoreland ultimately did ask, because he was a get along, go along general. And he did ask for 200,000 more troops, which he did not want. He didn't think he needed them. But he did ask for them because he was requested to. And what that would mean when it got back to President Johnson was that Johnson was going to have to call up reserves, or he was going to have to call up National Guard, because the draft just wasn't going to make enough soldiers to get that 200,000 men in the door fast enough. And that request is what put the country opposed.
Right.
The Americans responded with Tet as they just about always respond when the Republic is in trouble, they back the president. First thing it is, go. What do you need? What do you need? And that collapsed because they thought they'd been lied to when they were told they had this big victory. Johnson told them, Westmoreland told them, this was a big victory, folks. We won this battle. Walter Cronkite went over to Vietnam, and when he was there, he said, they're telling me that we're winning this war. And he went around as he did in World War II. Now, of all the people to review the Battle of Tet that should have understood what was happening, Walter Cronkite is number one. First place, he's highly respected in America. In second place, and equally important, he had knowledge. Unlike the guys today that go to Iraq or Afghanistan and talk about the war, and news people, they have no real experience in the military. Walter Cronkite had covered the military for years, and he'd covered 2 wars at this point in time, World War II and Korea. So he knew what he was talking about. He'd been in World War II when the Battle of the Bulge took place. The Battle of the Bulge was a massive attack by a beaten but still dangerous enemy. The Battle of Tet was the same thing. It was a massive attack by a beaten but still dangerous and very effective enemy. And that's what he missed in that particular battle. The next thing, talking about what happened after that, you had General Abrams took over, and General Abrams began Vietnamization. And almost immediately, he pulled 200,000 troops out and sent them home. Now, if Westmoreland had done the same thing after Tet and just said, I got 200,000 guys here I don't really need, and he did, because he had this huge logistic tail, which was there mostly if we were going to invade Cambodia or we were going to invade North Vietnam. You could have doubled the number of troops or tripled the number of troops in the field without increasing the logistic tail an iota, and it would have been sufficient to support either of those 2 invasions. In fact, it did support later an invasion of Cambodia, which was made by the South Vietnamese, not by us. So if that had happened, and if the forces had come back from Vietnam, then Joint Chiefs would have been happy. General Westmoreland would have been viewed a lot different from what he's viewed today, and rightly so. And the war would have been over. Now, when you look at the history and what people think of the war, the reality of this is not the general view, but this is the history of the war. There is no question about it. And the number of people that have written about it and tried to say, listen, y'all got to think this over again, because you're not thinking right. It's hard to learn the lessons of Vietnam if you're dealing with a biased and fractured history. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Steel Rain. It's a good book.